The massive crystal dome of the Galactic Council building caught the triple sunrise of Nexus Prime, casting rainbow patterns across the polished floors where representatives from 47 different species gathered for the most important session in decades. Ambassador Thrix of the Vorlani Empire clutched his datapad with all four arms, his insectoid features twitching with barely contained anxiety as he prepared to present intelligence that would shake the very foundations of galactic understanding. The humans had been part of the galactic community for exactly 53 years, 4 months, and 16 days. In that time, they had established colonies on 17 different worlds, built the largest merchant fleet in known space, and somehow accumulated enough military hardware to make even the ancient Corax hegemony nervous. Yet in all those years, humanity had initiated exactly 3 military conflicts, each lasting less than 2 standard weeks before their opponents surrendered unconditionally. Thrix's mandibles clicked nervously as he reviewed his notes one final time. The Vorlani were traitors by nature, information brokers who had survived in the galactic community for over 800 years by knowing exactly who posed a threat and who could be safely ignored. But humans had broken every pattern they understood about emerging civilizations. The council chamber fell silent as Prime Counselor Vex called the session to order. The ancient hegemony leader's scarred features bore the marks of countless battles, and his voice carried the authority of someone who had personally conquered 14 star systems. When Vex spoke, the galaxy listened. "We gather today to address growing concerns about human military capabilities and intentions," Vex announced. His words automatically translated into dozens of different languages. Ambassador Thrix of the Vorlani has requested this emergency session to share intelligence that he claims will alter our understanding of humanity's place in the galactic order. Thrix rose from his designated platform, his forelegs carrying him to the center of the chamber where holographic projectors would display his findings to the entire assembly. He activated his translator and began speaking in the rapid, clicking language of his people. "Esteemed colleagues, what I'm about to share will challenge everything we believe we know about human nature and military doctrine. For the past 18 months, Vorlani intelligence services have been monitoring human military activities across their territory. What we have discovered defies all conventional understanding of how emerging species behave when they acquire significant power." The first hologram showed the human fleet composition. Massive dreadnoughts that dwarfed anything in the Corax Navy floated alongside sleek destroyers equipped with weapon systems that registered energy signatures higher than most planetary defense grids. The assembled delegates murmured in various languages, their translation devices creating a symphony of concerned voices. "The human fleet now consists of over 3,000 combat vessels," Thrix continued, his voice growing more agitated. "Their technology incorporates advances that our scientists estimate would take most civilizations centuries to develop independently. Yet observe their deployment patterns." The second hologram showed human fleet positions throughout their territory. Instead of aggressive forward positions near contested borders or strategic resource points, the majority of human military assets were positioned around trade routes, refugee camps, and disaster relief operations. They spend 67% of their military budget on what they call humanitarian operations, Thrix announced, his translator struggling with the human concept. "Their warships carry more medical supplies than weapons. Their soldiers receive equal training in combat techniques and post-conflict reconstruction. It makes no sense from any strategic perspective we understand." General Brock of the Corax hegemony slammed one massive fist against his speaking podium, the sound echoing through the chamber like thunder. The scarred warrior had personally led the conquest of 7 different species and viewed the galaxy through the lens of strength and domination that had served his people for millennia. "Perhaps these humans are simply weak," Brock growled, his translator rendering his words in the harsh, guttural tones that made lesser species instinctively fearful. "Their emotional nature prevents them from embracing the reality of galactic politics. In a universe where only the strong survive, they cling to primitive concepts like mercy and restraint. but Ambassador Nix of the peaceful Torellian Federation raised a tentacled appendage to request speaking privileges. The Torellians had been among the first species to establish diplomatic relations with humanity, and their perspective carried weight precisely because they were known for their pacifist philosophy. With respect to General Brock, the Torellian experience with humanity suggests otherwise. Nix said, her melodious voice creating harmonics that her translator rendered as careful emphasis. Human diplomatic missions have resolved 17 different conflicts in our sector alone, often without a single shot being fired. They possess an understanding of negotiation and compromise that surpasses even our own diplomatic corps. The chamber erupted in discussion as representatives tried to reconcile these contradictory observations. How could a species simultaneously build the most powerful military force in the galaxy while consistently choosing diplomatic solutions over warfare? The mathematical probability alone suggested that such restraint was either impossible or hiding something more sinister. At the far end of the chamber, in the section reserved for newer galactic members, Ambassador David Williams of the Terran Federation sat quietly reviewing notes on his tablet. The human representative appeared unremarkable by galactic standards, dressed in simple dark clothing that contrasted sharply with the elaborate ceremonial garments worn by most other delegates. His calm demeanor and occasional note-taking seemed almost insulting, given that the entire assembly was discussing his species as if they were a puzzle to be solved. Williams had served as humanity's chief diplomatic representative for 7 years, during which time he had negotiated trade agreements worth trillions of credits, established peaceful relations with dozens of species, and somehow managed to keep humanity's true military capabilities from becoming common knowledge. His personnel file, available to any council member who requested it, showed a career diplomat with advanced degrees in xenopsychology and interstellar law. What it did not mention was his previous 15 years of service in the Terran military. Intelligence Division. Prime Counselor Vex finally called for order, his authority cutting through the babel of concerned voices. Ambassador Williams, your species has been the subject of considerable discussion today. The Council would appreciate your perspective on these observations about human military policy and strategic doctrine. Williams stood slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening as he walked to the center of the chamber. He activated the translation system and smiled pleasantly at the assembled representatives, his expression carrying the practiced warmth of someone trained in diplomatic protocol. Esteemed colleagues, humanity is honored by your attention to our military and diplomatic policies, Williams began, his voice carrying easily through the chamber's acoustic systems. We find that violence, while sometimes necessary for the protection of innocent life, is rarely the most efficient solution to complex political problems. The simplicity of his statement seemed to frustrate several of the more aggressive species representatives. General Brock leaned forward in his seat, his scarred features twisted into what might have been confusion or contempt. Efficiency, Brock repeated, the word sounding strange in his harsh accent. Your species has somehow managed to expand across 17 star systems, establish dominance over trade routes that were previously controlled by powers far older than your civilization, and force 3 separate military conflicts to end in unconditional surrender without sustaining significant casualties. Yet you speak of efficiency as if warfare were simply another form of resource management. Williams nodded thoughtfully, as if considering the general's words for the first time. That's an interesting perspective, General. Perhaps the difference lies in how we define success in military operations. The chamber fell silent as delegates waited for elaboration that never came. Williams simply smiled politely and returned to his seat, leaving dozens of species representatives with more questions than answers about human nature and intentions. Dr. Lyra Nix received the research grant notification while teaching her advanced xenopsychology seminar at the University of Prima Stella, the galaxy's most prestigious academic institution dedicated to understanding the behavioral patterns of different species. The message appeared on her personal communication device during a lecture about territorial expansion patterns among emerging civilizations. and the amount of funding attached to the project made her pause mid-sentence while addressing her students. The Galactic Council had approved the largest research budget in academic history to fund a comprehensive study of human military behavior and decision-making processes. 12 different species would contribute their finest behavioral scientists, anthropologists, and military analysts to spend 6 months embedded with human forces across their territory. The stated goal was to understand why humanity consistently chose diplomatic solutions over military ones. Despite possessing overwhelming tactical advantages, Dr. Nix had built her career studying the psychology of warfare among different species, and her published works on aggressive behavior patterns were considered essential reading throughout the galaxy. Her research had helped prevent 17 different conflicts by identifying early warning signs of military buildup and territorial disputes. But humans represented something entirely new in her experience, a species that seemed to violate every established principle about how civilizations behaved when they acquired significant power. The research team assembled on the neutral world of Gateway Station included some of the most brilliant minds in the galaxy. Dr. Grix from the Centauri Navy brought decades of experience analyzing military logistics and strategic planning. Professor Tal from the academic world of Kepler Prime had written the definitive study on resource acquisition behaviors among spacefaring species. Commander Zeph of the Andromedan Defense Force contributed expertise in weapons technology and tactical doctrine that had helped his people maintain peace for over 2 centuries. Their first destination was the Human Military Academy on Mars, where officers trained for service throughout human space. The facility appeared unremarkable from orbit, a collection of functional buildings surrounded by training areas and simulation facilities. But as their transport descended toward the landing pad, Dr. Nix noticed something unusual about the base layout. The weapons training areas occupy less than 30% of the total facility space. She observed, reviewing the architectural plans that human authorities had provided. Most military academies dedicate at least 60% of their resources to combat training and tactical exercises. Dr. Grix checked his own instruments, his compound eyes scanning the data readouts with practiced efficiency. Their energy consumption patterns are equally puzzling. The facilities drawing the most power are labeled as medical training centers, engineering workshops, and something called cultural sensitivity simulation chambers. The human officer who greeted them at the landing pad introduced himself as Colonel Rivers, a career military professional whose personnel file showed 23 years of active service across human space. His uniform was practical rather than ceremonial, and his manner was polite but reserved as he escorted them through the facility. "Our training philosophy emphasizes versatility," Colonel Rivers explained as they toured the Academy's main complex. "Modern military operations require officers who can function as diplomats, engineers, medical personnel, and cultural liaisons depending on the situation they encounter." The research team observed training exercises that defied everything they understood about military education. Human cadets practiced negotiation techniques with the same intensity they devoted to weapons drills. Medical training was mandatory for all students regardless of their chosen specialization. Most puzzling of all, every student was required to complete courses in post-conflict reconstruction and civilian population management. "They're training soldiers to rebuild what they destroy," Dr. Nix noted in her research log. The curriculum includes extensive instruction on infrastructure repair, medical aid distribution, and establishing functional government systems in occupied territories. But Professor Tal noticed something else during their tour of the weapons training facilities. The human small arms were designed with multiple settings, including several non-lethal options that seemed to be the default configuration. Military vehicles carried more medical supplies than ammunition. Even the Academy's wargame scenarios seemed focused more on minimizing casualties than achieving tactical objectives. "It's as if they're deliberately handicapping their own effectiveness," Dr. Tal observed during their evening briefing. "Every tactical doctrine we've reviewed prioritizes restraint over decisive action. The research team spent weeks interviewing cadets and instructors, trying to understand the philosophy behind human military training. The answers they received were consistent but unsatisfying. Humans spoke about something they called rules of engagement that imposed strict limitations on when and how force could be applied. They discussed concepts like proportional response and civilian protection as if these were fundamental laws of physics, rather than optional considerations. Dr. Nix found herself increasingly frustrated by the humans' apparent inability to think in terms of total victory or unconditional dominance. When she asked about scenarios where complete destruction of an enemy might be necessary, the human officers would politely redirect the conversation toward diplomatic alternatives or post-conflict reconciliation strategies. It was during their third week at the academy that Dr. Nix first noticed the restricted sections. Certain areas of the facility were marked with subtle warning signs and required special clearance levels that none of the visiting researchers possessed. When she asked Colonel Rivers about these restricted zones, his demeanor changed in a way that her professional training had taught her to recognize. Those areas contain classified training materials and equipment that aren't relevant to your research focus, Rivers replied, but his body language suggested discomfort rather than simple procedural necessity. The Academy's main educational programs are what you've been observing. Dr. Nix made careful notes about the Colonel's response, particularly his use of the phrase main educational programs, which implied the existence of secondary or alternative curricula. Over the following days, she began paying closer attention to the restricted areas and noticed several disturbing patterns. The restricted sections consumed significant amounts of power despite appearing largely unused. Personnel who entered these areas underwent different security procedures and seemed somehow changed when they emerged, more serious and reserved than typical academy staff. Most tellingly, the restricted zones were staffed by officers whose personnel files showed gaps in their service records that couldn't be explained by standard military deployment patterns. Dr. Grix used his technical expertise to analyze the facility's power consumption patterns and discovered that the restricted areas drew energy levels consistent with running massive computer simulations or advanced weapons testing. But when he requested clarification from Academy officials, he was told that such information fell outside the scope of their approved research parameters. The breakthrough came when Professor Tal gained access to the Academy's historical archives while researching the development of human military doctrine. The files were organized chronologically, and she noticed a sharp discontinuity in the records around the time humanity first achieved spaceflight capability. Earlier documents described military strategies and weapon systems that seemed completely inconsistent with everything they had observed about current human behavior. According to these historical records, early human military doctrine was based on concepts of total warfare and absolute victory, Professor Tal reported during a secure communication with the rest of the research team. They developed weapons capable of rendering entire planets uninhabitable and strategies designed to completely eliminate an enemy's ability to resist. Dr. Nix felt something cold settle in her stomach as she processed this information. What changed? Why did they abandon those approaches in favor of their current restraint-based philosophy? Professor Tal's response was barely above a whisper. The record suggests they used those weapons on themselves multiple times. The research team requested an immediate meeting with Colonel Rivers to discuss their historical findings. The human officer listened to their questions with growing tension, his professional mask slipping enough to reveal something that might have been fear. You're asking about classified historical materials that have no bearing on current military policy, Rivers said, but his voice lacked the confidence he had shown in previous discussions. Human military doctrine evolved to meet the challenges of interstellar civilization. Dr. Nix leaned forward, her scientific instincts fully engaged. Colonel, what are you hiding in those restricted areas? What is humanity so afraid of that? You deliberately limit your own military effectiveness? For a long moment, Rivers said nothing. Then he stood and walked to the window overlooking the Academy's main training complex. where cadets were practicing medical triage procedures rather than combat drills. Dr. Nix, some knowledge is dangerous. Some capabilities are too terrible to use except in the most extreme circumstances. Humanity learned that lesson the hard way, and we've spent the last 2 centuries making sure we never forget it. The security vault beneath Earth's primary military headquarters existed in a state of perpetual twilight, its corridors lined with servers containing the most classified information in human space. Dr. Lyra Nix followed Captain Torres through multiple checkpoint stations, each requiring different biometric scans and authorization codes that took nearly an hour to process. The deeper they descended into the facility, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as if the weight of stored secrets was physically pressing down on everyone who entered. Captain Torres had been assigned as the research team's military liaison after their discoveries at the Mars Academy raised questions that could no longer be deflected with standard diplomatic responses. Her personnel file showed 30 years of service in military intelligence, but her demeanor suggested someone who had seen things that most humans were never meant to know about. She moved through the security protocols with the practiced efficiency of someone who had made this journey many times before. Dr. Nix, before we proceed, I need you to understand that what you're about to see represents the darkest chapter in human history, Torres said as they approached the final security door. These records were sealed for good reasons, and they remain classified at the highest levels of government clearance. The main archive chamber contained thousands of storage units, each one climate-controlled and organized according to a classification system that seemed designed more to hide information than to make it accessible. Dr. Nix was escorted to a specific terminal that had been prepared for her research, with access restricted to materials deemed relevant to her study of human military behavior. The first files she accessed were labeled as Historical Military Doctrine Evolution and contained strategic analyses from humanity's early spacefaring period. But as she read deeper into the documents, she began to understand why Captain Torres had seemed so reluctant to grant her access to this information. The records described something called total war. That was completely alien to anything practiced by galactic civilizations, where most species fought for territory, resources, or political dominance while preserving the basic infrastructure and population needed to make conquest worthwhile. Humans had developed strategies designed to completely eliminate an enemy's capacity for resistance by any means necessary. They targeted civilian populations deliberately, Dr. Nix whispered, her translator struggling with concepts that had no equivalent in most galactic languages. Not as collateral damage, but as primary strategic objectives. The files detailed weapon systems that seemed designed specifically to cause maximum suffering rather than efficient military defeat. Chemical agents that could poison entire continents for decades, biological weapons that targeted specific genetic markers, and nuclear devices capable of rendering planets uninhabitable for thousands of years. But most disturbing were the psychological warfare techniques that sought to break enemy morale by demonstrating that no person or place was safe from human retaliation. Captain Torres had been monitoring Dr. Nix's research progress from a nearby terminal as she approached when she noticed the xenopsychologist's distressed reaction to the historical documents. These strategies were developed during what we call our world wars, Torres explained, her voice carefully controlled. Conflicts, where the stakes were so high that both sides abandoned any pretense of civilized behavior in pursuit of absolute victory. Dr. Nix scrolled through tactical manuals that described the systematic destruction of enemy infrastructure, the intentional targeting of medical facilities and schools, and the use of prisoner populations for experimental research. The calculated cruelty of these approaches made her species' own territorial conflicts seem like children's games by comparison. But this is impossible, Dr. Nix protested, her academic training rebelling against what she was reading. No civilization could survive implementing these strategies against other members of their own species. The psychological trauma alone would destroy social cohesion. Captain Torres pulled up another set of files, these ones labeled with dates. From humanity's pre-spaceflight period. They didn't survive it. Human civilization nearly collapsed 3 separate times during our world wars. We came within hours of completing our own extinction before finally developing the political structures necessary to prevent total global failure. The documents showed casualty figures that defied comprehension. Entire cities erased from existence in single attacks, civilian populations displaced by the tens of millions, and casualty rates that represented significant percentages of total human population. But most chilling were the psychological studies conducted after each conflict, showing how exposure to total warfare had fundamentally altered human society. Every human alive today is descended from survivors of these conflicts, Torres continued. We carry the genetic and cultural memory of what we're capable of when we stop trying to be better than our nature. Dr. Nix found herself reviewing technical specifications for weapons that made current. Galactic military technology seemed primitive by comparison. Fusion bombs that could crack planetary crusts, engineered plagues designed to target specific physiological characteristics, and orbital platforms capable of sterilizing entire star systems. The mathematics were undeniable, and the test results proved that humans had actually constructed and deployed these weapons against their own species. "Why are you showing me this?" Dr. Nix asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "This information could destroy human relations with every other species in the galaxy." Captain Torres activated another terminal and began accessing files with security classifications so high that Dr. Nix hadn't known they existed. Because you need to understand why humanity has spent the last 2 centuries trying to forget these capabilities exist. The new files contain something even more disturbing than historical records of past atrocities. They were labeled as emergency protocols and contained detailed plans for implementing total warfare, strategies against non-human threats. The technical specifications had been updated with current technology, and the casualty projections included analysis of every major galactic civilization. Dr. Nix read through contingency plans with names like Garden Protocol and Harvest Initiative that described systematic approaches to planetary sterilization and species elimination. The weapons described in these files incorporated advances in human technology that the galactic community had never suspected existed. Energy systems that could destabilize stars and biological agents designed to target non-human physiology. These aren't historical documents, Dr. Nix realized with growing horror. These are active military plans. Captain Torres nodded grimly. Updated quarterly and maintained at full operational readiness. Every human military installation has sealed orders that can only be opened under specific threat conditions. We pray those orders are never activated. The psychological impact of what she was learning finally overwhelmed Dr. Nix's academic objectivity. She found herself staring at weapon specifications that could end galactic civilization while sitting in a facility staffed by humans who seemed like perfectly normal, moral people. The contradiction was more than her mind could easily process. "How do you live with this knowledge?" Dr. Nix asked. "How does your entire species function normally while maintaining the capability for such absolute destruction?" Captain Torres was quiet for a long time before responding. "Because we remember what happened the last time we lost control. Every human child learns about the world wars, not just the dates and outcomes, but the personal cost of unlimited warfare. We teach them what we did to ourselves so they never forget why restraint isn't weakness." Dr. Nix spent the next several hours reviewing more files, each one adding another layer to her understanding of humanity's true nature. She learned about the psychological conditioning that every human military officer received, training designed, to ensure that total warfare capabilities remained locked away except under the most extreme circumstances. She read about the ethical frameworks that had been built into human society to prevent the normalization of extreme violence. But most important were the activation protocols for humanity's total warfare systems. The requirements for implementing these capabilities were so stringent that they could only be triggered by threats that genuinely endangered human survival as a species. Multiple independent command authorities had to agree, civilian oversight. Committees had to authorize action, and detailed post-conflict reconstruction plans had to be approved before any weapons could be deployed. "We don't rarely choose war because we're pacifists," Captain Torres finally explained as Dr. Nix prepared to leave the archive facility. "We rarely choose war because we know exactly what we become when we stop trying to be better than we are." The crisis began on a Tuesday morning when Turellian monitoring stations detected the approach of the largest Corax hegemony battle fleet assembled in over 2 centuries. General Brock had personally taken command of 300 warships, including the massive dreadnought Dominion that served as flagship for the hegemony's most elite combat forces. Intelligence reports suggested that Brock intended to use the peaceful Turellian colonies as a demonstration of Corax military superiority and a direct challenge to human influence in the region. Ambassador David Williams received notification of the developing situation while reviewing trade agreements in his office at the Terran Diplomatic Complex on Gateway Station. The message from Turellian Prime Minister Yala was brief but desperate, requesting immediate assistance under the mutual defense agreements that had been signed 3 years earlier. Williams read the message twice before activating his secure communication system to contact Earth's military command. "Turellian space is about to become a war zone," Williams reported to Admiral Chun, the head of Terran Strategic Command. "General Brock is bringing enough firepower to glass every inhabited world in their system. The Turellians have no military capability beyond basic system defense platforms." Admiral Chun's response came through encrypted channels after a delay that suggested significant discussion at the highest levels of government. "You're authorized to deploy with the mediator under diplomatic immunity protocols. Attempt negotiation first, but be prepared for alternative solutions if Brock refuses to withdraw." The UES mediator launched from its docking station at Gateway with minimal fanfare, appearing to observers as simply another diplomatic vessel responding to a developing crisis. The ship's hull configuration matched standard diplomatic transport designs, and its energy signature registered at levels consistent with peaceful merchant vessels. Only Ambassador Williams and the ship's small crew knew that the mediator represented something far more significant than its external appearance suggested. Williams used the 3-day journey to Turellian space to review intelligence files on General Brock and the political situation within the Corax hegemony. The general was considered a military traditionalist who viewed the galaxy through the lens of strength and conquest that had served his species for millennia. Recent intelligence suggested that Brock had grown increasingly frustrated with what he perceived as human weakness corrupting proper military relationships throughout the region. The Turellian system appeared peaceful when the mediator arrived, with civilian traffic moving normally between the inhabited worlds and their orbital installations. But long-range sensors detected the hegemony fleet holding position just outside the system's edge, their massive ships arranged in attack formation and waiting for some predetermined signal to begin their assault. Ambassador Williams opened a communication channel to the hegemony flagship, following diplomatic protocols, even though he suspected that Brock had no intention of engaging in meaningful negotiations. "General Brock, this is Ambassador Williams of the Terran Federation. I'm requesting permission to discuss the current situation and explore options for peaceful resolution of any disputes between the hegemony and the Turellian government." Brock's response came through with the characteristic harshness of Corax military communications. "Ambassador, your presence here is meaningless. The Turellians have been designated as subjects for demonstration of proper military dominance. Your species' pathetic diplomacy will not interfere with necessary action." Williams maintained his calm, diplomatic tone despite the obviously hostile response. "General, surely there are alternatives to military action that could address the hegemony's concerns. The Turellians are peaceful people who pose no threat to anyone." The communication channel crackled with what sounded like Corax laughter before Brock responded. "Precisely the point, human. They depend on your protection because they are weak. Today, the galaxy will see what happens to those who trust in human strength." The hegemony fleet began moving into the Turellian system with the massive dreadnought Dominion leading the formation. Smaller vessels spread out to surround the inhabited worlds while the main battle groups took positions for orbital bombardment. The tactical deployment was professionally executed and designed to prevent any possibility of civilian evacuation or military resistance. Williams watched the fleet movement from the Mediator's Bridge while maintaining an open communication channel with both General Brock and Tyrellian defense forces. The situation was developing exactly as he had expected, but he continued following diplomatic procedures until the final moment when negotiation became impossible. General Brock, I'm formally requesting that you halt your advance and engage in diplomatic negotiations to resolve this situation peacefully. Williams broadcast on all emergency frequencies. The Tyrellian people have done nothing to warrant military action. Brock's response was to order the bombardment to begin. Energy weapons from dozens of hegemony vessels began striking targets on the surface of Tyrellian Prime, starting with government buildings and infrastructure facilities, but clearly intended to spread to civilian population centers. The attack was methodical and brutal, designed to maximize terror rather than achieve specific military objectives. Williams stood in the Mediator's command center watching the destruction unfold on his tactical displays. The professional diplomat who had spent 7 years carefully maintaining humanity's peaceful image finally allowed his mask to slip as he witnessed innocent civilians dying while he maintained the pretense of helpless diplomatic protest. Computer. Activate Garden Protocol Authorization, Omega 77. Williams said, his voice carrying an authority that none of his crew had heard before. Transmit activation codes to Earth Command and request final authorization for total warfare protocols. The Mediator's hull began to change in ways that defied everything the galactic community thought they knew about human technology. External. Plating slid apart to reveal weapon systems that had been completely hidden during the ship's construction. Energy conduits that had been disguised as diplomatic communication arrays began channeling power levels that made nearby sensor equipment scream warnings. Williams opened a final communication channel to General Brock, broadcasting on frequencies that would ensure every ship in the system could hear his words. General, this is your last opportunity to surrender and withdraw your forces from Tyrellian space. Brock's response was exactly what Williams had expected. Your single ship against my entire fleet? I will enjoy watching your pathetic vessel burn while Tyrellian cities are reduced to ash. The Mediator's transformation completed just as Earth Command transmitted final authorization for Garden Protocol implementation. Williams felt the weight of 2 centuries of human restraint lifting from his shoulders as weapon systems that had never been tested in actual combat came online for the first time. All hegemony vessels, this is Ambassador Williams of the Terran Federation. You are targeting innocent civilians and have refused all opportunities for peaceful resolution. You have forced humanity to stop trying to be better than our nature. Williams turned to his tactical officer, a young lieutenant who had trained her entire career for a moment she had prayed would never come. Lieutenant Morrison, you are authorized to demonstrate why humanity rarely chooses war. The hegemony fleet continued its bombardment of Tyrellian surface targets, confident that a single human diplomatic vessel posed no meaningful threat to their overwhelming tactical advantage. General Brock had studied human military responses to previous conflicts and noted their consistent pattern of minimal force and humanitarian concerns, but as the Mediator's true capabilities became apparent, something fundamental shifted in the balance of power within the Tyrellian system. The ship that had arrived as a diplomatic vessel now registered energy signatures that exceeded anything in the galactic community's understanding of possible technology levels. Williams opened one final communication channel to the galaxy at large, knowing that his next actions would change humanity's relationship with every other species forever. This is why we choose restraint, he announced, his words being automatically transmitted on every emergency frequency. Not because we are weak, but because we remember what we become when we forget to be better than our nature. The first shot fired by the hegemony fleet consisted of concentrated plasma bursts from 50 different warships, energy levels sufficient to vaporize most vessels instantly upon impact. The barrage struck the Mediator's defensive shields and simply stopped, the destructive energy absorbed and converted into power for the human ship's own weapon systems. General Brock watched in disbelief as his overwhelming firepower not only failed to damage the diplomatic vessel but actually seemed to make it stronger. Lieutenant Morrison activated the Mediator's primary weapon system with the cold precision that her training had instilled, despite years of hoping she would never need to use these skills in actual combat. The main energy cannon emerged from concealed housing within the ship's hull, its barrel length extending to nearly half the vessel's total size as charging sequences initiated power levels that registered off most sensor scales. The targeting computer identified General Brock's flagship, Dominion, as the primary threat and calculated firing solutions in less than 2 seconds. The weapon, charged to full capacity, drew power directly from the ship's main reactor, plus the energy absorbed from the hegemony attack, creating a coherent beam of destruction that had never been tested against a living target. Morrison pressed the firing trigger at exactly 17 seconds after Ambassador Williams had authorized the demonstration of human capabilities. The energy beam that emerged from the Mediator's main cannon traveled at near light speed across the distance separating the two vessels, striking the massive hegemony dreadnought with focused destructive force that exceeded anything in galactic military experience. The Dominion and its crew of 50,000 Corax warriors ceased to exist at the molecular level. The massive warship that had served as the flagship of General Brock's career simply vanished, leaving only empty space where one of the most powerful vessels in the galaxy had been moments before. No debris, no explosion, no electromagnetic signature that would indicate destruction had occurred. The remaining hegemony vessels attempted to retreat, but found their faster-than-light drive systems no longer responding to commands. The Mediator's secondary weapons had activated targeting systems that could selectively disable specific technologies without destroying the ships that carried them. 300 Corax warships found themselves trapped in normal space, unable to fight effectively and unable to flee. Ambassador Williams opened a communication channel to the hegemony fleet using transmission power that overrode their ability to block or ignore his signal. His voice reached every survivor in the battle group as he began explaining what they had witnessed and why humanity had been forced to reveal capabilities they had hoped never to use.